All right. So Joe Grandos Timothy Chelliah, right?
Yeah,
Hopefully I said your name right. And your
yeah,
topic is Abjection to Affirmation, reading Dalit
yeah,
women's poetry.
yeah, yeah. Uh, my article is titled "Objection to Affirmation: Reading Dalit Women's Poetry." No knowledge is innocent. Knowledge creation and dissemination are embedded in cultural and social contexts, which are invested with power. Intuitive knowledge, which literary arts grant about the self and the external world, also most often conditioned by the infiltration of ideology. Arts and literature have served to intuitively and mysteriously understand reality. These non absolute affective categories do not lay claim to scientific objectivity. Rather, their ambivalent, amorphous nature makes them a viable space for contestations and reconstructions. In oppressive cultures, the poetic space opens up pathways of negotiating and understanding the world. So, for the subjugated peoples, the instrumentality of art and literature, the poiesis, which in Greek would mean to make, to create, is a symbolic act of affirmation. Dalits, the historically marginalized groups in India, have a long history of suffering and assertion. Formerly framed as untouchables outside the Varnashna Dharma, which is the Hindu text codified in Hindu religious texts, Dalits have been subjected to numerous humiliating experiences, denied access to resources and intellectual labor, that is to say, outside the symbolic order, at the macro level, they have been turned into objects of abjection, socially ostracized and forced to live outside the village. The upper castes defined who they are and prescribed their roles in society. Different labels like untouchables, unseeables, and approachable, scriptural, Harijan given by Gandhi, and scheduled caste, constitutional term of identification, have been employed to describe them and to contain them within the epistemological and political institutions. The redefinition of Dalit subjectivity at the Dalit Panthers Conference in 1973 declared a new identity emphasizing a broken down or ground down reality as positive terms of identification, simultaneously rejecting descriptors given by benevolent and paternalistic oppressors. Despite the abolition of caste constitutionally, caste hierarchy and prejudice manifest in subtle ways. Dalit engagement with their reality and the caste system as a whole continues along with political activism through literary production. The spurt in Dalit literature in 1990s is a phenomenal moment in the history of Dalit movement. Dalit literature, particularly life writing and poetry, played a significant part in in Dalit assertion, which primarily consisted in reconfiguring the knowledge about themselves. The narrativization of Dalit life by Dalits themselves is a performative aimed at challenging the representation of Dalits by upper caste writers in Indian literature. Dalit women's position within the category called Dalit is more precarious since they undergo marginalization at the intersection of class, caste, and gender or patriarchy. They endure overlapping and discrete patriarchy, and discrete patriarchy is related to caste, whereas overlapping patriarchy is connected to the larger Brahminical structure of opposition. A critic named Gopal Guru, in his essay Dalit Women Talk Differently, points at internal and external factors as justifications offered by Dalit women to talk or portray or represent themselves differently from the other women, or the concept of universal womanhood is helpful here. The danger of non Dalit forces homogenizing Dalit women is primarily an external factor, and the patriarchal domination within Dalits is a major internal factor. Another critique named Sharmila Rege, in her essay Dalit Women Talk Differently, a critique of difference and toward a Dalit feminist standpoint position, argues that the existence of multiple patriarchies is a result of both Brahminical conspiracy and the relation of caste group to the means of production. So, the new and autonomous Dalit subjectivity and Dalit literature explored the myths of universal womanhood and male supremacy in casteist contexts. Reggae also takes Gopal Guru's ideas further and postulates that politics of difference could spiral down into identitarian politics, which she avers would be detrimental to Dalit women's agenda. Hence, she argues the Dalit women's assertion centers discourse on caste and gender, suggesting a Dalit feminist standpoint position. The standpoint theory proposes to valorize marginalized groups and their knowledge categories, both inherited and experiential. The Dalit woman counterpublic is engendered in the fact that Dalit men cannot write on behalf or like the Dalit women. They, according to Gopal Guru again, Dalit men, male writers, do not take serious note of the literary output of Dalit women and tend to be dismissive of it. And the argument held against Dalit men is that Dalit men reproduce the same mechanism used by upper caste to dominate Dalits. So, there is the need for us to consider Dalit women's poetry as a significant category of literary production and knowledge creation about themselves. So, I would like to argue that Dalit women's poetry encodes the experience of Dalit women, leading to a new and resurgent Dalit female, self-observant and observant of the world, interrogating and remapping the world. So one of the poems that I have taken for analysis is She Was Told by Aruna Gogulamanda. This is written originally in Telugu language, another Dravidian language, and translated into English by the same poet. By the way, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So this is the poem. The poem She Was Told puts in focus the complex relationship between the knower and the known, the world and the one who experiences the world in the vitiated caste context. The poem describes the many ways the Dalit female experiences subjugation. The caste markers and caste performances are inscribed on her body. She was told is repeated almost as a refrain in the poem, emphasizing the formation of Dalit female identity. It occurs as an effect of caste gender discourse. There are two moves, so to speak, in the poem. The first move consists in the way the Dalit female is produced as the object of abjection. The caste gender nexus births her as an object of contempt, an insult, as dirt, or simply a Dalit. Another crucial factor to notice in the poem is the projection of the Dalit female body. It becomes the locus of such ideological and political construct. And we should not forget Michel Foucault's idea of how the body becomes the target and the object of power. The poem here, it could be specifically the caste power. The poem catalogs list of injunction writ large on her body. She is the sexual device who is ordered not to wear a blouse. The exoticized, eroticized, and inferiorized body is kept under the constant surveillance and gaze of the upper caste male. The body becomes the substratum of caste power. The body is attributed with specific cultural meanings and becomes naturalized. To quote Michel Devos, in body studies, there is no body but the painted body. The painted body would refer to the cultural marking. And she further argues that without such cultural markings, it is difficult to move in any channels of social exchange. Historically, also, Dalit women were barred from covering their upper bodies. In case they wanted to cover their breasts, they had to pay a tax called the breast tax. So, Dalit female body is disciplined to patiently accept and bear, I quote, the cruel thrashings, the jeers, and sexist assaults of a man or her master on her body, which she hardly knew. The alienation from her own body is experienced both as the subject experiencing the subjugation and pain, and as an effect of the objectification in the casteist sexist discourse. She is also seen as the laboring machine, the roughened hands and the wrinkled face are bodily evidences of her oppression. She is forced into exploitative labor, deprived of food and water. The intergenerational victimhood is her story, and she is an heir to several stories of countless deaths of a mother and daughters paying for the price for being a female. So the first move describes the Dalit female as inhabiting a discourse that expels her from society. She was told, the poem also attempts a definition. The second move, suggested by the use of the passive voice, highlights a distance and a disjuncture. The voice in the poem, presumably the Dalit woman, seeks to extricate herself from the conditions that she is portraying about herself through the conscious use of the passive voice. The poem seems to play around the Cartesian dualism. Descartes emphasizes the rational as a subject, distinct from the external world, the object. The subject is the thinking self or the entity and is the most certain element which can perceive, judge, understand, or simply ratiocinate. The disjuncture occurs here through the passive and through the use of the passive voice and the distancing between the subject and the object. The subject here is the object as the subject, hyphenated word, object as a subject. The object of definition is also the experiencing subject. So when the object as subject in the oppressive context enters the realm of the literary and the signifying system, the inversion happens, leading to a breakdown of logic of attributed meanings. The liminality between the subject and object is an abject that returns to the logic or that returns to disturb the caste controlled social order. The social order is maintained through the social consensus, which in this case is the caste/patriarchal ideology. The boundary between the enduring suffering self and the witnessing self as the subject here blurs. In this cusp that is formed lies the possibility for repudiation of dominant ideologies and the reconfiguration of female Dalit identity. So I would also like to discuss a few more poems. So this is the picture of Nangali, a person who cut off her breasts because of the breast tax, right? So this was there in South India for some time until the late 19th century, even during the early 20th century. The next poem is My Body by a Tamil Dalit writer named Sugirdarani and translated into English by Lakshmi Holmstrom. So I would like to say a few words about Dalit women poets writing in Malayalam and Tamil particularly. These poets also foreground the body. Body becomes the subject of Dalit female poetry. And though this projection of foregrounding of the female body is not new in Tamil poetry, the way it is reimagined by Dalit women describes the new politics and new subjectivity. Lakshmi Holmstrom, the translator of these poems, observes the ways in which our poets have imagined and depicted the body is constantly intriguing and refreshing. She also notes, with reference to another Tamil poet, not a Dalit poet, Putti Revati's poems, that these poems tend to incline towards the erotic. She cites the poem Rain River, Malayan Nadi. In her estimate, these poems identifies with natural landscape, location within the Tamil erotic tradition. This tradition draws from the Agam poems of Sangam, reference to Sangam literature. So I would argue that there is this collating of the female body with the natural landscape, and that is a very interesting point because that is one way these Dalit writers try to produce knowledge about their body, the feelings in their body, and the various sensations in their body. So if you take a look at this poem, My Body, by the Tamil Dalit female poet Sugirtha Rani, she makes use of the landscape imagery. She imagines her subjugated body as the land and as the emotional seasons associated with them in Tamil literature. It draws parallel to 5 landscapes and their corresponding affect. In this poem, a redefinition and a repositioning of the female body is sought. She maps her body through its various seasons, emotional ups and downs, various pleasures, conflicts, and creative energy. Finally, she reclaims her body as her own, as part of nature. She returns her body to the original state, untouched by the cultural and caste markings. The space of Dalit poetry allows them to imagine a prospect of freedom from ideologies. The last section, as it climbs down, scarlet ash scatters from volcano's gaping mouth, a vortex whirling clockwise agitates the earth. The day's heat dissolves into the night's coolness. In the end, nature becomes my body lying still. This section, which is the last section of the poem, there are images of turbulence and violence contrasted with the serene association of the Dalit female body and nature at the end. So the metaphorization of Dalit female body as the elements of nature aesthetizes the suffering and creates new ways of representing the subjugated body. The next poem, Night Beast, is also by Sugirtha Rani. And this poem describes the sexual pleasures the female voice experiences. In a bold move, the poem pictures the pleasures experienced by the woman. Light rays from my eyes settled on the loose folds of man's clothes as he slept in the front room. From the self-loathing affect created by predatory sexual violence in the caste context, the persona, through a string of images, explores her own pleasures. The sexual awakening occurs simultaneously with the attainment of awareness about her body and the politics around it. She feels at the end the night beast has fled, returning me to myself. The repossession of the body is also the reclamation of her agency, her desires, and her sexual pleasures. Earlier alienated from her own body, she finally reunites with her body through the sexual pleasure mode. What is considered a taboo in Brahminical context is changed into a personal, a pure desire. In fact, the impure is embraced as a personal desire, rectifying a millennial control over Dalit women's sexuality. The breast tax is also one way of controlling Dalit woman's body and also her sexuality. Okay, so in summary, I have another poem also, but I think I will stop here. In summary, Dalit women's poetry uses body as a significant metaphor, abjected and abused, the return to their alienated bodies as a source of celebration and self-knowledge. While it may be granted that the poems give an inventory of the pain and suffering, they do not just end there. There is materiality of corporeal traumatization, and at the same time a forceful representation of Dalit bodies. The poetics of Dalit women's poetry lies in the powerful images and metaphors they weave into the language of the poems as a new way of comprehending the world, that a world that constantly tries to define them and the world that they try to define for themselves. Pramod Noyer argues that metaphorization and symbolization, the literary styles, so to speak, of the Dalit poetry discussed, amplify and extend the documentary real because of the realist's seeming inadequacy to capture the unspeakable horror that lies beneath the corporeal trauma of everyday lives. What happens here then is a stretching of realism to incorporate the everyday, the presence of the extreme within everyday. The new Dalit subjectivity is constructed in the liminality of what is determined and what is created, or what can be created, or what is creatable. Thank you. I would like to take questions if there are some questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And could you, maybe I had this question while I was listening to your presentation. What was the, let's say, motivation for analyzing these poems, for researching the topic overall? Any
I,
specific like moments that led you to researching these
yeah,
poems?
I am deeply passionate about these issues of marginalization and the way they have been aesthetically represented in literary texts and the instrumentality of the arts and the literature in general in representing the marginalized peoples. So I'm also interested in race studies. My PhD is also on Dalit literatures in general, but I focused on the narratives, longer narratives for my PhD. So I thought for a change, I could work on poetry, and particularly Dalit poetry and Dalit poets from South India, which I'm familiar with. So
So,
this could be seen as the motivation, perhaps.
mhm. So it was basically close to your interest, right? As you mentioned, as your
Yeah.
studies as well. And I had another question at the beginning, related to the reception of these poems. Do you have any information about how it was received or how such poems are received in, let's say, Indian society as a whole? Are
Yeah.
they received? Yeah, sure, go on.
Yeah. As far as reception of Dalit literature is concerned, I would say people are reluctant to
Mm,
completely accept Dalit literature as real literature, right? They say the aesthetics or lack is lacking, and Dalit critics have tried to uh, argue differently. You know, they have a different aesthetics for Dalit literature, so it's about politicalization of aesthetics. So some progressive upper castes would read Dalit literature, but Dalit themselves have used Dalit literature, particularly poetry, for their in their movement, Dalit movement. So I would say it's becoming more and more visible through translations, right? Becoming more and more visible because some of us are pitching for Dalit literature and Dalit poetry in literary classes. Universities, big universities in India, do not have uh, courses on Dalit literature, right? Except maybe Hyderabad University or Delhi University, right? Even when we tried to introduce the Dalit literature in 2008, we were faced with lots of opposition and criticism. So I think it's kind of divergent if you ask me about the reception of Dalit poetry in particular and Dalit literature in general. There are two attitudes. One is embracing and reading Dalit poetry and accepting the Dalit aesthetics as against the upper caste aesthetics of literary production. On the other hand, there is reluctance also. So I wouldn't say overwhelming reception is there. That is not there. Still a marginalized subject within the academia in India.
Thank you very much. I had some kind of a feeling like that at the beginning, yeah, that it might face some issues, but I hope that it will change as
Yeah.
time goes on.